Hey everyone, Sebastian here. As the title of today's episode suggests, I'm going to be discussing the Roman Emperor Caligula. If you're going to talk about the life of Caligula, then you also have to explore some pretty dark subject matter, including sexual violence of all sorts. So, if you do not want to hear that, or you are listening with younger people, be advised. Thanks so much, and enjoy the show. 2008 was a tough time to be a citizen of Naples, Italy. A decades-long waste management crisis was coming to a violent crescendo. The causes of this crisis were complex and involved the mismanagement of multiple Italian governments dating back to the 1980s and the illegal practices of the criminal organization known as the Camorra, who had come to monopolize the waste management business in the southern Italian region of Campania. The issue had technically been at crisis levels since 1994, when the Italian government formally declared a state of emergency in the region around Naples. But despite that, the situation was allowed to decline for over a decade. Things finally came to a head in January of 2008, in what the Italian authorities dubbed the emergency of the emergency. The latest twist in the ongoing drama had resulted in tons of trash going uncollected in the streets of Naples and the surrounding suburbs. The trash had started to accumulate in the streets back in the spring of 2007, but by January, after the Christmas festivities, the piles of trash had in some places become unsightly mountains. Some of the people of Campania, fed up with years of corruption and the deteriorating state of their home, started protesting, sometimes violently. At times during the unrest, massive piles of garbage were set on fire. Like I said, it was a tough time to be a citizen of Naples. And yet, for some reason, in the spring of 2008, I thought it would be the perfect time to go to Naples. I happened to arrive in the city during what proved to be a short window between waves of garbage-related unrest. I've been backpacking, and I'd heard through some fellow travelers in the hostels I was staying at that despite the recent turmoil, Naples was kind of awesome. Northern Italy had been incredible, but it had been expensive, especially for a recent grad trying to travel on the cheap. My hostel mates promised me that Naples was more affordable, the food was mind-blowing, and the city was an easy day trip from some of Italy's most beautiful and historically significant locales. It was a city that needed to be navigated carefully, but I was told that there were many upsides for the adventurous but prudent traveler. After wading through a sea of tourists in Florence, a virtually tourist-free Italian city sounded kind of refreshing. And yes, I do understand the irony that I was very much one of those tourists contributing to that sea. But, such is the eternal paradox of tourism. Anyway, despite some trepidation, I went for it. At the time, it seemed like the waste crisis had ended. History would show that this was just a calm in the storm. But when I saw Naples, it felt like the city was on the other side of something. The city, famous as the birthplace of pizza, did not disappoint. Neapolitan pizza blew my mind. A quick 1-hour train ride in almost any direction took you to remarkable Roman ruins. The famous volcanically preserved remains of the city of Pompeii are a manageable 40 minutes outside of the city. Jump on a ferry in the Bay of Naples, and for 15 or 20 euro, you could be taken to a lovely spot along the Amalfi Coast, or whisked away to the legendary island of Capri. I found a very affordable hostel in the city, but it was run by a somewhat eccentric Neapolitan fellow who told me at the age of 23 that I was going to make an excellent grandfather one day. Always been an old soul, I guess. Now, this hostel still seems to be in operation, so I'm not going to mention the name. But the owner and proprietor insisted on sitting down with every new guest and walking them through the do's and don'ts of visiting Naples. A lot of what he shared was valuable advice for staying safe in the city. But this gentleman was also keen on talking his guests out of going to some legitimately cool places. At one point, he told me not to go to the Amalfi Coast because there are places in Australia that are just as beautiful, which still strikes me as some of the weirdest travel advice I've ever been given. Don't go to this beautiful spot just at your fingertips here. You could always just fly to Australia. Weird. This guy was especially adamant that I not waste my time going to Capri. His reasons for this were largely, and surprisingly, historical in nature. I remember very clearly this gentleman saying something along the lines of, I truly believe that my ancestors, the ancient Romans, were among the most horrible and disgusting people to ever live on Earth. Now, I was a little shocked by this, so I asked him what he meant. And he said that Capri had once been the playground of the Roman emperors, and they had defiled the beautiful setting while satisfying their unchecked psychopathic urges. The worst offender on Capri, he believed, was the Emperor Tiberius. He then went on to explain in fairly graphic detail rapes, crimes against children, and murders committed for sport. The moral of his story? Don't go to Capri. Bad things happen there. Now, thankfully, I didn't take his advice. I caught the ferry and checked it out for myself. Turns out, Capri is gorgeous. Go to Capri. As far as I could tell, the only crime endemic to the island in 2008 were the exorbitant prices for gelato. Now, to be clear, I don't think my host's superstitious feelings about Capri really reflect a larger feeling in Naples. Since then, I've shared this story with other Italians, and they've all found it pretty funny. But I never forgot this man's personal belief that the Emperor Tiberius had essentially cursed the island. Then, as I was researching this show, thumbing through my copy of the Roman historian Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars, this memory came rushing back. There, in the pages of Suetonius, were all the depravities laid out to me by my Neapolitan host. In his later years, the Emperor Tiberius, sick of politics in the capital, had indeed made Capri his primary residence. The Romans, who valued the idea of a life lived in public, were always suspicious of excessive privacy. The idea of an emperor sequestered away on a private pleasure island gave rise to all sorts of shocking rumors, all of which were dutifully reported by our guy Suetonius. In fact, I'll just turn it over to him. Suetonius writes of Tiberius, quote, "On retiring to Capri, he devised a pleasance for his secret orgies, teams of wantons of both sexes, selected as experts in deviant intercourse, copulated before him in triple unions to excite his flagging passions. Its bedrooms were furnished with the most salacious paintings and sculptures, as well as with an erotic library in case a performer should need an illustration of what was required." End quote. But these live sex shows were just the start. Suetonius also tells us that the emperor liked to join in, often in violent and disturbing ways. Suetonius explains, quote, "The story is also told that once at a sacrifice, attracted by an acolyte's beauty, Tiberius lost control of himself, and hardly waiting for the ceremony to end, rushed him off and debauched him and his brother and the flute player too, and subsequently, when they complained of the assault, he had their legs broken." End quote. The stories just get more upsetting from there. Now, I don't want to be too gratuitous about this stuff, But the most infamous story, the one my Neapolitan host was still outraged over some 2,000 years later, was reported by Suetonius like this, quote, "He acquired a reputation for still grosser depravities that one can hardly bear to tell or be told, let alone believe. For example, he trained little boys, whom he termed minnows, to crawl between his thighs when he went swimming and tease him with their licks and nibbles." End quote. Yikes. So, what should we do with these stories? Is this just more ancient slander, or is there anything to them? In this case, it seems like the experts are torn. The classicist T.V. Boutre has called the stories, quote, "pure canard," end quote. But others aren't so sure. Most agree that Suetonius was reporting the most exaggerated and salacious version of events, but he may not have invented these stories wholesale. The Roman historian Tacitus, who is generally considered to be more trustworthy, presents a less gossipy but still upsetting portrait of Tiberius on Capri, writing that Tiberius, quote, "resorted once more to the rocks and solitude of the sea, in shame at the sins and lusts whose uncontrollable fires had so inflamed him that, in the kingly style, he polluted with his lecheries the children of freeborn parents." End quote. Now, to be clear, just because Tacitus reports something doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but it should make one consider these claims a bit more seriously. The classicist Edward Champlin has, from a close analysis of the Latin used by both Suetonius and Tacitus, argued that they were working from the same original source, likely written by a Roman aristocrat from Tiberius's own time who hated the emperor. So if these stories were invented, they were likely invented by one of Tiberius's contemporaries. But others, like historian Alois Winterling, remain skeptical, especially in instances where the stories about Capri overlap with the life of the notorious future emperor Caligula. When Caligula was around 18 years old, he was summoned to Capri, ostensibly so Tiberius could keep a close eye on one of his potential heirs. Suetonius tells us that while he was on Capri, the teenage Caligula distinguished himself as the worst kind of two-faced suck-up. Apparently, he was embarrassingly servile when he was in the presence of the Emperor Tiberius, but then horribly cruel when he was around anyone else. It was allegedly said of him that, quote, "no one had ever been a better slave or a worse master," end quote. But of course, our guy Suetonius doesn't stop there. He goes on to write, quote, "Yet even at that time he could not control his natural cruelty and viciousness, but he was a most eager witness of the tortures and executions of those who suffered punishment, reveling at night in gluttony and adultery, disguised in a wig and a long robe, passionately devoted besides to the theatrical arts of dancing and singing, in which Tiberius very willingly indulged him, in the hope that through these his savage nature might be softened." This last was so clearly evident to the shrewd old man that he used to say now and then that to allow Gaius to live would prove the ruin of himself and of all men. End quote. It's in this passage that the historian Alois Winterling detects a lie. In his opinion, this is a great example of an ancient author using the cut-and-paste model for writing slanderous history. While the Romans loved theater, actors and other theatrical types were considered among the lowest members of society, more derided than sex workers. Caligula, wearing wigs and indulging in theater, would have been understood by Roman readers as completely unseemly. But Winterling points out that this story about Caligula gallivanting around Capri in disguise is ridiculous. Capri wasn't really a place that you could move about in disguise, especially if you were someone as significant as the future Emperor Gaius. Everyone on Capri was part of the emperor's entourage. There wasn't a town separate from the emperor's estates that would have had a theater or even a tavern. Any shows on Capri were happening at the villa. This isn't something Caligula could have done in secret. Winterling tells us, quote, Suetonius has thus ascribed to him attributes reported from the youth of a later emperor in Rome, similarly hated, namely Nero, end quote. It's very true that Nero's scandalous love of the performing arts was well attested to. He was the emperor who was always keen to join actors on stage and treat his guests to long performances on the lyre. As fans of the podcast know, the most enduring historical myth about Nero, that he played his tiny harp while Rome burned, is a riff on his well-known obsession with all things theatrical. Winterling thinks that Suetonius simply took a slanderous detail from another emperor's life and slapped it on Caligula. Because why not? There are other suspicious things about the passage as well. Suetonius writes about executions taking place on the island, but that isn't mentioned by any other source. And typically, executions would not have happened on Capri. He also adds that the Emperor Tiberius secretly knew that Caligula was evil and even considered having him killed. But this contradicts his earlier point that Caligula was a master dissimulator who cleverly masked his true character in front of the emperor. What was it? Was Caligula brilliantly two-faced or a beast who couldn't help but show his true nature? Suetonius would like to have it both ways. Many of Suetonius's claims fall apart upon close scrutiny, which makes one wonder if anything he wrote about Capri, Tiberius, or Caligula are true. It turns out that many of the most horrific stories about Caligula, aka the Emperor Gaius, are likely exaggerations or pure fiction. This raises the question, why? Why slander the Emperor Gaius? What did he do to deserve all this bad press, historically speaking? Suetonius may have been happy to record the most vicious rumors, and even borrow a few from some other emperor's life. But why did he feel like Caligula deserved that treatment? What were the real bad things that Caligula did that made Suetonius and his ilk comfortable with inventing a bunch of fake bad things to add to his rap sheet? Let's see if we can figure it out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 196, How Bad Was Caligula? Part 2. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind you that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and start supporting the show at $5 or more every month. You will get access to an ad-free feed and a long list of patrons-only extra episodes, interviews, and other good stuff. So head over to patreon.com/ourfakehistory to see what I'm working on right now and see if there's a level of support that works for you. While I have your attention, I need to point out that this is episode number 196, which means we are getting dangerously close to the 200th episode of this podcast. In celebration of that milestone, I'm going to try something that I think could be really fun, hopefully. I am dubbing the 200th episode the Call-In Spectacular. Yes, for episode 200, I'm going to be taking calls and answering your questions. I'm hoping this will be a fun spin on the traditional Q&A episode. So if you have a question for me or want to hear your voice on this podcast, then there are a couple of ways that you can go about this. One, record a voice memo or small audio file on your phone or computer, and then email it to me at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. But if that's too complicated, you can literally call in to a voicemail box that I have set up just for this occasion. Call toll-free to 1-800-397-0870 and leave your message. The 200th episode is going to be released on April 2nd, 2024, so if you want to be included, then you should have your message in no later than March 27th. Also, before you call in, consider going back and listening to my previous Q&A episodes to see if I've already answered a question that you have about the show. The more interesting and novel the question, the more likely I'm going to use it on the podcast. All right, I hope this works. Okay, this week we are returning to ancient Rome to continue our look at the life and reign of the infamous Emperor Gaius, better known by his childhood nickname, Caligula. This is part 2 of what is going to be a 3-part series. And I know I said last time that this was going to be a 2-parter, but it turns out I had a lot to say about Rome's early emperors. Now, people often ask me why I don't label the episodes part 1 of 2 or part 1 of 3. The reason is that this happens all the time. I don't usually call my shot in part 1 because often I'm writing the script for part 2 and I realize that I'm going to need a part 3. This happens to me all the time. But if you don't know, my solemn promise is that no series will ever exceed 3 parts. Trilogies are the max. I have my reasons. So, if you've not heard part 1 of this series, then I strongly suggest that you go back and give that a listen now. In part 1, I set the topic up by discussing how Caligula has been remembered in modern pop culture. I then looked at his early life, the plots that led to the deaths of many members of his immediate family, and I threw some cold water on the stories about the teenage Caligula committing incest with his sisters. I also spent a good chunk of that episode trying to explain how the form of government known as the Princeps worked during the early years. It was an unusual arrangement where the all-powerful autocrat at the top of the system pretended like he wasn't really an all-powerful autocrat. The first emperor, Augustus, had developed this approach as a way of placating Roman pride, nodding to his society's ancient distrust of kings, and keeping powerful aristocrats on board with his new regime. Augustus had learned from his adopted father, Julius Caesar, that if you rubbed these senators' noses in the fact that they were powerless, you were liable to get a knife in the back. This system relied heavily on what could feel like meaningless theater. But I've been convinced by the historians that I've been reading that this theater was actually very important, especially during the time of the Julio-Claudians. You see, Caligula has been remembered as the Mad Emperor. He was cast as literally insane by some of our ancient sources, chief among them the Roman historian Suetonius. Since that time, many historians have followed Suetonius's lead and presented Caligula as a psychologically unbalanced person who managed to get hold of the Roman reins of power. Over the last 50 years, there was even a trend among some experts to properly diagnose Caligula's supposed mental illness. But more recently, many experts have pushed back against the idea that Caligula was a chaotic and insane mad emperor. It's been argued that in trying to diagnose Caligula, we've been giving too much credence to stories that are obviously false. It also obscures why Caligula was so deeply hated by the ancient writers. I've been convinced that understanding the weird political magic trick that was the early Principate might be the key that unlocks this whole story. If I can keep this magic show analogy going, then Augustus was the master magician who delighted with his skillful lies. Everyone understood that it was an illusion, but they appreciated that he was putting on a good show. Augustus's successor, Tiberius, on the other hand, hated the show that he had inherited, and for the most part, just refused to go on stage. Caligula learned how to perform all of his great-grandfather's tricks, and then, halfway through the show, turned on the lights, pointed out all the trapdoors and trick mirrors, and called the audience a bunch of idiots for clapping for any of it in the first place. But in a dark twist, the audience remained trapped in the auditorium. Even though the magician had ruined the illusion, everyone was compelled to stay in their seats until the show was over. It wasn't long before the restless crowd started to think that maybe they should kill the magician. Now, how exactly does this all relate to the tumultuous 4-year reign of Caligula? Have I fallen in love with another one of my elaborate comparisons? I thought this thing was supposed to be a custom muscle car, man. Stop mixing your metaphors. Okay, point taken. Let's dive in to the specifics of Caligula's rise and fall and see if any of my elaborate analogies hold up. The Emperor Tiberius died in March of 37 AD, after having held the position of Princeps for 22 years. Tiberius had never enjoyed the game of imperial politics, especially the most awkward elements of it. And the most awkward moment of all was undoubtedly the succession. This was where the veil between the fiction that Rome was still a republic and the reality that it had become something much more like a hereditary monarchy was at its thinnest. When Tiberius became emperor, his reticence to accept the Senate's honors, whether or not that was real or a loyalty-testing performance, pointed to this uncomfortable truth. So it's perhaps fitting that before Tiberius died, he left the question of the succession fairly ambiguous. He created a will that split all of his holdings between two inheritors, Caligula and Tiberius's teenage grandson, known as Tiberius Gemellus, who I'll just call Gemellus for the sake of clarity moving forward. Now, this didn't help anything. Certainly, one's estate could be divided up, but the position of Princeps wasn't technically something that could be split in two. at least not at this point in Roman history. So this meant that both potential heirs had factions and supporters that grew up around them. But Caligula ultimately played the game better. Caligula's father-in-law, by way of his first marriage to a young woman named Junia Claudilla, was the influential aristocrat Marcus Junius Silanus. Silanus helped shore up support for Caligula among the senators. Caligula also gained the support of the Praetorian prefect, a man named Macro. This was especially important, as the support of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite bodyguard, would become an essential part of securing power in Rome going forward. If the Praetorian Guard didn't accept you, you couldn't be emperor. In fact, as history progressed, there would be more than one instance where the Praetorians essentially chose the emperor. Now, Caligula also had the added benefit of being Germanicus' son and being incredibly popular with common Romans. His popular support, coupled with the backing of the Praetorians and Silanus' aristocratic connections, made Caligula an unstoppable candidate. When Tiberius died, he very easily pushed past Gemellus and became the emperor. Now, of course, there are a number of salacious stories concerning the death of Tiberius. Suetonius rattles off a few, writing, quote, "Some think that Gaius," that is Caligula, "gave him a slow, wasting poison. Others, that during convalescence from an attack of fever, food was refused him when he asked for it. Some say that a pillow was thrown upon his face." End quote. Now, even Suetonius betrays his lack of certainty on this one with the qualifying, "some say." Now, you should know, the story about Caligula poisoning Tiberius is only found in Suetonius. No other source mentions it. So we can set that one aside as probably not true. Tacitus tells us that Tiberius had been ailing for a long time in a villa in Campania. Then, the emperor finally seemed to stop breathing. It was assumed that the old man was dead, so Macro, the Praetorian prefect, led the assembled guests in hailing Caligula as the new Caesar. But just then, Tiberius woke up and started breathing again. This caused a small panic among the aristocratic guests who were terrified that Tiberius would take vengeance on them for prematurely hailing a new emperor. According to Tacitus, Macro was not interested in making the succession any more messy than it already was, so he took matters into his own hands. In the commotion, he went to the emperor's room and smothered the old man to death. Problem solved. Is Tacitus' story more accurate? We don't know. I leave it to you to either accept or reject that particular murderous tale. What's clear is that after Tiberius' death, the Praetorian Guard hailed Caligula as imperator. As far as the men with swords were concerned, Caligula was the emperor. I would argue that this was an important moment in the history of Rome, as it illustrated that, despite the table dressing, the emperor's power really didn't come from the Senate. The Praetorians had made their choice known. The ascension of the Emperor Gaius was greeted with cheers in Rome, both from the plebs in the street and the august men in the Senate. Tiberius had not been a popular figure, and the dashing 24-year-old son of Germanicus seemed to be everything that Tiberius was not. Suetonius even claims that during Caligula's triumphant arrival in Rome, the people shouted, "To the Tiber with Tiberius." The Tiber, of course, being the main river that flowed through the capital. "Throw the old guy in the river. We like our new king." And indeed, Caligula leaned into the idea that things were going to be different now that he was Princeps, The good times had come again. Many writers, even the gossipy Suetonius, admit that the first 8 months of Caligula's reign were quite promising. Modern historians like Alois Winterling would argue that the first 2 years of the Emperor Gaius's reign were quite competent, if not exceptional. Unlike his predecessor, Caligula very gracefully played his role as the senators officially bestowed on him the package of honors that gave him all the powers of Augustus. And, like Augustus, Caligula made speeches flattering the senators, pledging the restoration of the Republic, and humbly asking that no statues of him be erected in the city. People should not think of him as anything more than the first man of the Senate. He also prudently waited 3 months before assuming the office of consul for the first time. This way, the current office holders could finish their terms without having to resign. The truth was that Caligula could have forced them to resign, but in not pushing it, it saved those senators from a minor embarrassment. And that's how this game was played. When he finally took up the office of consul, he gave a speech custom-made to win the approval of the senators. He used the occasion to distance himself from his unpopular predecessor, and he doubled down on an earlier pledge that Tiberius's much-loathed treason trials, which had resulted in political witch hunts, would never again return. He also made a handful of concessions that, if upheld, would give the Senate more power in the governing of Rome. The speech worked exactly as intended. Many of the senators were relieved that Caligula seemed to be trying to model himself on Augustus. In fact, the Roman historian Cassius Dio reports that, quote, the Senate, fearing that he might change his mind, issued a decree that the speech should be read every year, end quote. Caligula was playing the game like a pro. He also distanced himself from the famously frugal and dour Tiberius by spending lavishly on public games and festivals. Whereas Tiberius rarely appeared in public, Caligula made himself the star of the show. Historian Alois Winterling describes that, quote, the people of Rome were invited to a banquet in the city, and games were held on an unparalleled scale. 400 bears and the same number of beasts of prey were killed in the arena, and chariot races allowed young aristocrats to display their most dashing form. Caligula appeared in a triumphal chariot drawn by 6 horses, end quote. So, while the talk in the Senate was all, hey, like my great-granddad, I am just the first among equals, out on the streets, Caligula was riding a golden chariot. But still, this was welcomed. The people liked it when the emperor was present at festivals and games. Tiberius's absence had been noticed and had won him no love from the people. However, Caligula was perhaps a little too enthusiastic about these public entertainments for aristocratic tastes. He got involved more than was considered proper. For instance, he very publicly supported one faction in the chariot races, and this was considered a little gauche. Now, even today, world leaders are supposed to present as neutral when it comes to sports. Now, Americans know that presidents are allowed to have favorite teams, but whoever wins the Super Bowl or the NBA championship gets an invite to the White House. The Roman emperor was kind of supposed to be the same way. Caligula was a little too into his team. But in the early days, this was hardly a deal breaker. The first 2 years of Caligula's reign were also marked by new building projects and investments in infrastructure like roads, city walls, and aqueducts. He also funded the creation of a new port facility in Sicily that would better supply all of Italy with grain. Sounds like a great emperor, right? Well, eventually there was a turning point. I mentioned in the last episode that Suetonius famously started chapter 22 of his Life of Caligula with the ominous lines, quote, "So much for Caligula as emperor. We must now tell of his career as a monster." End quote. While the transformation may not have been that extreme, something certainly changed in Caligula. But exactly when that change happened and for what reason has been the source of some debate. Many have pointed to a strange mystery illness that befell the emperor 8 months into his reign as Princeps. The sources are not clear what this illness was. However, we're told that it put him in bed for around 2 months, and there were serious concerns that he might die. Now, starting in the mid-1950s, some historians warmed to the idea that this illness caused some form of brain damage. That brain damage perhaps explains a personality change in Caligula that resulted in his more erratic, paranoid, and violent behavior in the latter part of his reign. Experts have proposed a number of different maladies that could have caused this, including encephalitis, lead poisoning, and neurosyphilis. One of the more enthusiastically embraced explanations was that this illness was actually a particularly bad series of seizures brought on by a lifelong struggle with epilepsy. In a recent paper by a group of Colombian medical researchers, the authors entertained the possibility that Caligula may have experienced something called status epilepticus, which is when a seizure lasts more than 5 minutes or a number of seizures happen in quick succession. If this in fact occurred, then Caligula's brain may have been damaged in a way that left him with emotional, behavioral, and cognitive problems. The authors of this study explain that, quote, "After this episode, Caligula showed constant mood swings with irascibility or unmotivated laughter, lack of impulse control, perverse behaviors, hypersexuality, and sadism, and was terrified by thunder and loud noises. Caligula also suffered from severe insomnia and could not sleep more than 3 hours per night. Furthermore, he experienced delusions of grandeur, paranoid episodes, and strange behaviors. All these symptoms fit what in modern epileptology is known as epileptic psychosis." End quote. Okay, epileptic psychosis. So that does provide a nice, neat explanation for some of the more audacious stories found in the ancient sources. But there are problems. First, the timeline doesn't fit as cleanly as it should. Now, this is hard to surmise if you're just reading Suetonius, as he doesn't really write chronologically. Instead, his work is arranged thematically. So he'll have one section all about public works projects, then another about military campaigns, then another about sexual excesses, and another about murders. It can be challenging to determine where all of these little anecdotes are supposed to fall on the timeline. But thankfully, modern experts have been able to construct a more coherent timeline by combining the works of Suetonius with others like Cassius Dio, Seneca, Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, and Tacitus, where we have him. Alois Winterling has made a very strong case that Caligula's behavior did not shift suddenly after this mystery illness. In his biography of Caligula, he demonstrates quite clearly that the emperor continued to govern in that moderate Augustan style for at least a solid year after he recovered. Winterling also points out that many of the stories that these experts are using to diagnose Caligula are often fabrications. Other experts like Garrett Fagan have also pushed back on these diagnoses, pointing out that even Suetonius credits Caligula with quote-unquote good acts well past the point that this illness was supposed to have changed him permanently. But part of the reason the case for a brain-changing illness has gotten some traction is that not long after he recovered, Caligula embarked on his first major act of political violence. While he was sick, it was rumored that some in his inner circle were starting to plot against him. What if the emperor should not survive? Who would be the next emperor? Well, the most obvious choice was the other young man named in Tiberius's will, Gemellus. It was rumored that Gemellus himself had started to openly hope for Caligula's death. What's worse, two of Caligula's most important early allies were thought to have been shoring up support for Gemellus should Caligula die. These were the Praetorian prefect Macro and Caligula's now former father-in-law, Silanus. When he recovered, the Emperor Gaius caught wind of these rumors and moved quickly against what may have been the germs of a conspiracy. Gemellus was publicly accused of plotting against the emperor and was compelled to commit suicide. Macro was shuffled out of his post as Praetorian prefect, presumably to take a new role as the governor of Egypt. But once he was out of that key position as head of the Praetorians, he was similarly denounced and executed. Finally, Caligula publicly demoted Silanus in the Senate, which was widely understood as a signal to the senators who wanted to impress the emperor that they should find a way to destroy this man. Seeing the writing on the wall, Silanus chose to take his own life before his senatorial colleagues could denounce him and deny his children their inheritance. Now, it might be tempting to interpret this purge as a paranoid and violent outburst brought on by a damaged brain. But that obscures just how common this kind of political violence was in ancient Rome. Remember, Caligula's brothers, mother, and quite possibly his father had been killed as the result of politically motivated plots. Is it that surprising that at the first whisper of a conspiracy, Caligula acted decisively and violently? Given the details of his life, we don't need a damaged brain to help explain why Caligula might have been paranoid. Interestingly, the writing of one of Caligula's contemporaries, Philo of Alexandria, records that many people at the time believed that this purge was just sound policy. Philo writes that some politics watchers would say of Gemellus's sad fate, quote, "Sovereignty cannot be shared. That is an immutable law of nature. This is defense, not murder." End quote. The point is that at least some Romans did not perceive this purge as a sign of insanity. It was logical. But this purge was a dark sign of things to come, as conspiracies against the emperor and the ensuing reprisals would become a hallmark of the rest of his time as Princeps. Now, the other moment that often gets brought up as a turning point in the reign of Caligula was the death of his sister Drusilla in the year 38. Caligula was incredibly close to his sister, hence the untrue slander about incest. Her death in 38 affected him deeply. He grew his hair and beard long, he instated a long period of public mourning, and he even had his sister deified and accepted into the Roman pantheon of gods. Up to this point, only Julius Caesar and Augustus had been given the honor of deification after their deaths. For the sister of a living emperor to be given this unique honor, that was kind of novel and a bit of a break with religious tradition. This was one of the first times that Caligula really threw his weight around as emperor to do something unorthodox. Once again, he was pushing the boundaries of what was considered respectable. Was Caligula experiencing a grief-induced mental breakdown? It's hard to say. He was certainly affected by Drusilla's death. But again, Alois Winterling points out that Caligula remained largely moderate in his governing style until the year 39. Winterling argues that it was at the start of the year 39 that something occurred that drastically shifted the relationship between the emperor and the elites in the Senate. This would be the start of what would become an all-out war between Caligula and Rome's aristocracy. This may help us understand the genesis of many of the most outlandish tales about the emperor. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll explore how an initially competent and beloved emperor became one of Rome's most hated rulers. As you might have noticed, one of the modern historians whose work I've been citing quite a lot in this series is the German expert Alois Winterling. And my goodness, I hope I'm saying that name correctly. Aloys, Alois. Anyway, Winterling's work has been helpful because he's among the most skeptical voices we have when it comes to the outlandish stories about Caligula. He's also great at demonstrating exactly why certain stories should not be trusted. My kind of guy. One thing I'm constantly checking on my end is that I'm not getting overly enamored with his conclusions. After all, he's just one expert. But Winterling's most unique take on the life of Caligula has to do with the turning point in Caligula's reign. This is an often overlooked conspiracy against the emperor that was uncovered by Caligula in the early months of the year 39. Now, it's often overlooked because the ancient sources are very vague about what prompted this conspiracy and exactly who was involved. The year 39 started out peacefully enough, with Caligula once again dutifully resigning the consulship so that other worthy men could climb to the top of the ladder of prestige known as the cursus honorum. Then, the ancient historian Cassius Dio tells us that, quote, "Many of the foremost men perished in fulfillment of sentences of condemnation, and many others of lesser prominence in gladiatorial combats. In fact, there was nothing but slaughter," end quote. So, what's going on here? Why was it that in the early part of 39, a bunch of senators were put to death? Either there was a vast conspiracy orchestrated by many of the top men in the Senate, some of whom were former consuls, or Caligula came to believe that there was a vast conspiracy. Winterling feels confident that the conspiracy was real. A group of senators and other hangers-on were plotting to kill Caligula. But what remains unclear is why this conspiracy occurred. What had Caligula done to provoke this? And this is where one needs to be open to the idea that Caligula was not always a model Augustan Princeps during those first 2 years. Perhaps some of the stories concerning his cruelty and arbitrariness might have had some truth to them. For instance, it's reported that while Caligula was sick, one sycophantic senator loudly declared that he wished for the gods to take his life in place of the emperor's. Another brown-noser claimed that he would fight in the arena as a gladiator if Caligula was restored to health. These men had clearly hoped to win the favor of the emperor and maybe even be rewarded for these performances of devotion. These stories also seem to suggest that these men thought that Caligula was probably gonna die. But when Caligula recovered, the emperor darkly insisted that these men keep their promises. One was forced to commit suicide, and the other was fitted for combat and sent to a bloody end in the arena. Even the skeptical Winterling thinks that there might be something to these stories, as it fits with a later pattern. Caligula started to loathe senatorial double talk, the meaningless praise that they gave him, and the pathetic clamoring for favor. This type of hyperbolic praise was a key part of the imperial game as designed by Augustus. But it was a game that Caligula was now tiring of. Emperors were supposed to reward men for being obsequious, not literally make them die as gladiators. Moments of cruelty like this, coupled with Caligula's flashy public persona, his uncouth enjoyment of public games, and his willingness to use his power to have his sister deified, all pushed at the edges of good taste. That, and his violent purge of Gemellus, Macro, and Silanus, may have been just enough to spook some senators into conspiring against him. After this conspiracy was uncovered, and those involved were executed, Caligula made a speech to the Senate that Winterling believes could be understood as something like a declaration of war between the emperor and the aristocracy. The fact that this conspiracy involved high-ranking former consuls seems to have been particularly upsetting to Caligula, as it underscored how phony the game that they played in the Senate truly was. There, the fiction was that Caligula was loved, and that he was only Princeps because the Senate deemed him to be so deserving. It wasn't because he was part of the imperial family. We don't care about that. No, these honors were being voted to him out of love and recognition of his greatness. But this kind of plot pointed out just how much this was a fiction. Many of these men secretly hated Caligula. Some wanted him dead. Now, Caligula could have kept the fiction going by having the Senate join him in condemning the specific conspirators. But instead, the emperor went another route. In his speech, he called out the whole institution and put the whole political charade on blast. The historian Cassius Dio quotes his speech at length, and many experts believe that Cassius Dio may have been working from senatorial records, which would have preserved the real speech. So it's likely that Caligula actually said this stuff. In the speech, the emperor calls out the Senate for years of hypocrisy. To this end, Caligula produced the trial records from the treason trials of his mother and two older brothers. Then he read out the terrible things that many of the still sitting senators had said about his family members. Of course, they had made these denunciations when it was politically expedient to do so, only to recant when the political winds changed. Now, this was an especially shocking move, because at the start of his reign, Caligula had publicly burnt these trial records as a way to demonstrate that all would be forgiven in the new regime. This was supposed to be the dawning of a new age where old enmities would be forgotten. It turns out Caligula had copies of those records made before they were theatrically burned. This wasn't the end. Caligula kept going on about how hollow all the Senate's honors truly were. He brought up how the senators had honored Tiberius and the ambitious praetorian prefect Sejanus while secretly hating them, saying, quote, "If Tiberius really did do wrong, you ought not, by Jupiter, to have honored him while he lived. But it was not Tiberius alone that you treated in a fickle manner. Sejanus you also first puffed up with conceit and spoiled, then put him to death. Therefore I too ought not to expect any decent treatment from you." End quote. To really hammer the point home, Caligula then quoted from a speech that he credited to Tiberius, but was likely something that Caligula wrote himself. In this speech, Tiberius allegedly advised Caligula that when it came to the senators, quote, "Show no affection for any of them, and spare none of them, for they all hate you, and they will murder you if they can. Do not stop to consider then what acts of yours will pleasure them, nor mind if they talk, but look solely to your own pleasure and safety, since that has the most just claim. You will be honored by them whether they wish it or not." End quote. That last point was especially dark. The Senate will honor you whether they wish it or not. Basically, Caligula said, let's get this straight. I can do whatever I want, and you have to honor me. Let's stop pretending that you guys have any real power. You don't. You think you do. I've been letting you think that you do for the sake of peace. But then some of you start thinking that your power might be real. Some of you start thinking that you can come for me. But that's not how this works. This game we're playing where I pretend that my authority is a gift given to me by the Senate, that's over. I get my authority from being descended from Augustus, someone we all agree is a god, and the men with swords who are sworn to me. This is the point in the story where Caligula stops the show, points to the trapdoor, the mirrors, and the smoke machine, and reminds the audience of the humiliating truth that they still need to applaud for him, or else. Winterling explains it like this, quote, "Once the emperor had exposed the double-speak in communications between the aristocrats and himself, every statement addressed to him in the Senate from then on had already been condemned in advance. It was duplicitous, and the emperor knew it. And the senators knew that the emperor knew that they knew that he knew." End quote. I love that little turn of phrase there. But Winterling's point is that in his anger at this recent plot, Caligula basically destroyed the possibility for politics to return to normal. Again, Winterling sums it up like this, quote, "This amounted to a declaration that the Augustan Principate was ended. Caligula had given the political paradox of the age, the contradictory combination of republic and monarchy, its real name, and declared himself for one side only, the monarchy." End quote. Now, if we go with Winterling on this one, and I should say this is not the only way to interpret the life of Caligula, just one interesting take. But if we go with Winterling, then this is the heart of why Caligula was so hated by the Roman senatorial class, and those later Roman historians who were all themselves very much part of the Roman senatorial class. Caligula humiliated the senators. Caligula reminded them of the ugly truth that they had been completely impotent for decades. He said the quiet part loud. But it didn't stop there. After this speech, Caligula really leaned into ridiculing and debasing the senators. This, of course, only inspired more assassination plots and conspiracies, which in turn prompted more violent reprisals from the emperor. A dark cycle of violence had begun. All of this helps put one of the more bizarre stories about Caligula in context. One of the most repeated tales that you'll hear about the mad emperor has to do with his favorite racehorse, Incitatus. The story goes that Caligula was enchanted with this horse, which, of course, was part and parcel of the emperor's unhealthy obsession with public games, chariot races, and gladiatorial competitions. The obsessed emperor allegedly gifted this horse a palace fitted out with marble stables, an ivory manger, and purple blankets for Incitatus to sleep on. He granted the horse a large household staff to take care of him. Then he allegedly invited his horse to dinner, where he fed him barley corn made of gold and toasted him with golden goblets. Most scandalously of all, Caligula made plans to appoint his horse consul of the Senate, the highest position a Roman aristocrat could aspire to. Now, when these stories appear in the writing of Suetonius and Cassius Dio, they're presented as examples of Caligula's madness. This unhinged megalomaniac, drunk on power, cavorting with a horse. How much worse could it get? Now, when I started researching this topic, I expected to learn that this whole horse story was a historical myth. What I learned instead is that many experts think that there might be some truth at the heart of this story. Winterling and Garrett Fagan both believe that Caligula honoring this horse may have been part of a dark practical joke played by the emperor. They point out that even in the most salacious version of this story, it's always made clear that the horse was never actually made consul. Suetonius, as always, is the most suggestive, but he only feels comfortable writing that Caligula planned to make the horse consul, not that he actually did it. Winterling explains that having an elaborate household and dining with the emperor were special privileges that were only to be enjoyed by the Roman aristocracy. Banqueting with the emperor was an especially important part of Roman politics that served to reinforce alliances and grease the wheels of senatorial proceedings. Augustus understood this deeply and was known to attend a different banquet every night to keep all the right people happy and on board with the regime. Tiberius hated this ritual, and when he left Rome for Campania, stopped banqueting with the aristocracy altogether. Caligula had been banqueting in the Augustan fashion, but after the year 39, he publicly declared that he was done playing games to satisfy the aristocracy. So, he might as well invite his favorite horse to dinner. By dining with a horse, or joking about dining with a horse, he was saying that this ritual that the aristocrats thought was so important was actually meaningless. The emperor's power didn't come from them. Their power came from him. And Caligula could give that power to whoever he wanted to, even a horse. He could even make his horse consul, because that's how this system really worked. Winterling and Fagan think that this may have all been a dark joke at the expense of people who very much wanted to be the consul. Augustus had preserved the cursus honorum, those rungs on the political ladder that aristocratic Romans loved climbing. People strove their whole lives to be consul. The prestige of that position still mattered to them, even though all the real power was in the hands of the emperor. By joking that his favorite horse could be consul, Caligula was reminding an entire class of Romans that their ambitions were meaningless. If he wanted, he could appoint a horse, and the senators would have to applaud and pretend that the horse was doing a good job. Winterling and Fagan think it's likely that Caligula had merely joked about eating with his horse. But if he did eat with the animal, it was not because he was disturbed. It was because he was trying to make a point. Indeed, many of the stories about Caligula from this point onward have to do with humiliating upper-crust Romans, a class that he now broadly considered to be his enemies. The stories become increasingly elaborate, violent, and sexually demeaning. But how many are true? Caligula had ripped the fig leaf off the Roman political system. He wasn't interested in being the first man of the Senate. He was interested in being a king. Scratch that. He was interested in being a god. In other words, the next part of Caligula's reign was the emergency of the emergency. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will conclude our series on Caligula. As always, before we go this week, I need to give a shout out to the following people. Big ups to Oda, to Brittany Crosby Banyai, to Tracy Hardwick, to David Quirk, to Annalisa Castaldo, to Sheila Heath, to John Kruger, to Robert Beckius, and to Casper Kring. All of these folks have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you so much to everyone who supports at all levels. Thank you to everyone that writes nice reviews of the show. Thank you to everyone that buys shirts at the TeePublic store. You're keeping this podcast going, and I think you're the best. If you want to leave a message for the 200th episode Call-In Spectacular, remember to call 1-800-397-0870 or create a voice memo and email it to me at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. Reach out as well on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. Find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory. Find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. Find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. Also, go to the YouTube channel and check out the Our Fake History digital shorts. Just go to YouTube and search for, you guessed it, Our Fake History. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.